Detroit is not collapsing quietly. It is collapsing loudly enough that every boardroom from Tokyo to Berlin is recalculating where the next decade of the global auto industry will actually live. And tonight, the uncomfortable truth is this. While America is struggling to hold the line, Canada is quietly stepping into a role nobody expected it to claim this fast. What was supposed to be Detroit's patriotic revival has instead opened a strategic doorway for Ottawa, and insiders say Canada is already walking straight through it. The promise was simple. Tariffs would protect American factories, punish offshoring, and bring jobs roaring back. But the reality unfolding across the continent feels nothing like a revival. Stellantis, the company that once looked like the pillar of North American manufacturing, is slamming the brakes on its operations. Production lines are freezing. Shifts are being cut. Entire communities in Michigan and Indiana are waking up to the news that their plant, once a generational anchor, is temporarily idled, a phrase that workers now describe as corporate code for "you should start looking elsewhere." Executives inside Stellantis admit privately that they saw this storm forming long before the headlines caught up. One insider described the moment the first tariff paperwork came down as the day long-term planning died. Margins tightened. Cross-border shipments suddenly carried price tags that made no sense. Projects meant to define the next 10 years were shoved into folders labeled "pending political clarity," and Detroit's biggest gamble, using tariffs as a pathway to dominance, began to look like a trap. And that is where the shift begins. Because as the American side of the border wrestles with uncertainty, Canada is playing a different game entirely. Insiders in Ottawa say the government anticipated that the tariff war would detonate right at the center of Detroit's supply chain. The old system, parts flowing back and forth across the border 6, 8, 10 times before a vehicle reached the showroom, could not survive becoming a penalty zone. Every crossing meant another cost. Every cost meant another reason for automakers to rethink their footprint. "We didn't need to wait for the crash," one Canadian trade official noted. "We could see the imbalance forming in slow motion." The imbalance is now visible to the world. Stellantis' staggering losses, General Motors facing a multi-billion-dollar tariff hit, Ford pulling its full-year guidance because executives do not know how bad this could get. All of it sends a message to global investors. The American market is becoming unpredictable. Policy shifts are abrupt. Costs are volatile. Planning feels like guesswork. That volatility is Canada's opportunity. Over the past months, while American officials defended the tariff strategy as necessary economic medicine, Canadian ministers were working the phones. European partners received quiet invitations to discuss deeper auto and battery cooperation. Executives in Seoul and Tokyo were pitched on a new proposition: invest in Canada, use its trade agreements as a shield, and escape the whiplash of American political cycles. Asian automakers that once treated the United States as their unquestioned North American base are now requesting briefings on Ontario's industrial incentives. This is not noise. This is movement. The same instability that is choking Detroit is making Canada look like the last predictable anchor in the region. No overnight policy shocks. No tariffs announced at dawn. No sudden rewrites of long-term contracts. One senior industry analyst put it bluntly: if the United States wants to gamble, manufacturers will find a safer table. And right now, that table is north of the border. The fear spreading through Detroit is not just about factories slowing down. It is about something far more existential: the possibility that the center of gravity in North American auto manufacturing may shift permanently. The world is watching Stellantis bleed billions, but what they are really watching is Canada rising. And as this story unfolds, the next question is already forming. If Canada continues to seize this moment, how long before global automakers start treating Detroit as history and Canada as the future? Stellantis was never supposed to be the breaking point. For years, analysts treated the company as the unshakable anchor of Detroit's global footprint, a merged powerhouse with European discipline, American brand loyalty, and enough scale to survive any market turbulence. But that confidence evaporated the moment tariffs hit at full force. And by the first half of 2025, the numbers told a story too brutal to spin. Instead of its usual multi-billion-dollar profit, Stellantis staggered into a loss of more than $2.5 billion. A collapse so sudden that one executive described it as the financial equivalent of having the floor ripped out from under us. The pain spread quickly. Plants in Ontario, Michigan, and northern Mexico were paused, then reclassified as temporarily idled, a phrase that has become the industry's most feared euphemism. Workers who had spent decades inside the same walls found themselves sent home with no promise of return. Local unions demanded clarity, but all they got were carefully scripted statements about evaluating the impact of market conditions. Off camera, insiders admitted that the company was drowning in tariff costs and scrambling to retool its supply chain around a political storm it did not create and could not control. Then came the internal upheaval. Carlos Tavares, long viewed as the architect of the Stellantis empire, was pushed aside. His replacement, Antonio Filosa, stepped in with what analysts called the least enviable job in the global auto industry. One industry insider summed it up bluntly: "You don't fire the CEO in a strong position. You fire him when the board is panicking." Investors who once praised Stellantis for being agile and integrated began whispering a harsher assessment: too slow to adapt, too exposed to cross-border manufacturing, too vulnerable to the political volatility now emanating from Washington. But crucially, Stellantis was not suffering alone. Its collapse became the alarm bell for the broader industry. General Motors had spent the early months of the tariff rollout projecting calm, stressing discipline, and promising to weather the storm by leaning harder on high-margin trucks and SUVs. That optimism crumbled as internal projections started circulating. Tariffs were expected to cost General Motors up to $4 or even $5 billion for the year, an amount equal to entire development programs. One General Motors strategist put it in simple terms: that's not a headwind. That's a direct hit to the heart. Ford's situation was no better. The company warned of a $1.5 billion tariff impact and made a decision that rattled Wall Street. It withdrew its full-year guidance altogether. Translation, as one financial analyst put it, they just admitted they can't predict their own future. Behind the scenes, Ford quietly slowed several EV programs, shuffled budgets toward its profitable truck lineup, and began prioritizing short-term cash over long-term innovation. This was not strategy. It was survival. For ordinary Americans, none of this played out in earnings reports or shareholder calls. It showed up on dealership lots. Sticker prices climbed by thousands. Loan terms stretched longer. Families walked into showrooms planning to buy and walked out realizing the math no longer worked. Demand softened. Dealers reported inventory piling up. Executives tested discounts to keep sales moving, but those discounts cut deeper into margins already weakened by tariffs. That is when the real structural damage began to surface. North America's advantage had always been its deeply interconnected manufacturing network. Engines cast in one state, machined in another, assembled in Mexico, then bolted into a truck in Michigan or Ontario. Parts didn't just cross borders. They wove the region together. Tariffs turned that strength into a liability. Every border crossing now carried a penalty. Accounting departments struggled to track which components fell under which tariff list, a list that insiders said changed faster than we could update our spreadsheets. In Detroit, frustration turned into something darker: fear. But across the border, the tone was entirely different. Canadian officials, supply chain economists, and automotive insiders saw the moment for what it was: a rare geopolitical inflection point. Not engineered by Canada, but usable by Canada. A senior official in Ottawa said it most clearly: "Every crisis for Detroit is a signal to us. If they destabilize, we stabilize. If they close off, we open up." The split in strategy was unmistakable. While Detroit companies were bleeding cash and cutting programs, Canada was crafting a narrative of reliability. While Detroit warned workers to brace for temporary layoffs, Canadian ministers were assuring global automakers that Canadian plants had no intention of throttling production unless absolutely necessary. The contrast grew sharper every week, and in boardrooms across Europe and Asia, decision-makers were starting to ask a new question. If Detroit is cracking, who replaces it? More and more, the answer being whispered back was the same. Canada is not just surviving this moment. It is positioning itself to rise from it. The unraveling of North America's once seamless supply chain didn't begin with a dramatic explosion. It began with paperwork, specifically tariff paperwork that turned every border crossing into a financial penalty and every shipment into a gamble. For decades, automakers treated the U.S. Canada-Mexico manufacturing loop as a single ecosystem. A part cast in Ohio could be machined in Ontario, assembled in Coahuila, then bolted into a finished vehicle in Michigan without anyone blinking. Efficiency wasn't just a goal, it was the foundation of the business. But in 2025, that entire model buckled under the weight of a policy designed with slogans, not supply chains, in mind. Inside the industry, engineers and logistics managers described the same moment of realization. One automaker insider told us, "We didn't just lose predictability, we lost the map." Tariffs were applied not to a car as a whole, but to the thousands of pieces flowing across the border 6, 8, 10 times. What used to be an elegant circuit became a tripwire-laced maze. Suddenly, a bolt from Mexico cost more. A wire harness from Ontario carried an unexpected fee. A module assembled in Tennessee, but containing a single imported connector, became a compliance headache. Entire production flows had to be rerouted on the fly. For Detroit, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a direct attack on its core identity. Motors run on engines, but Detroit runs on certainty, knowing where parts come from, what they cost, and how they move. That certainty dissolved almost overnight, and workers on the ground could feel it. Plants that once ran like clockwork found themselves pausing mid-shift because a shipment that used to take 24 hours now needed to clear new documentation labyrinths. As one Michigan line supervisor put it, it was like watching a finely tuned orchestra try to play while someone kept switching the sheet music. But the chaos wasn't evenly distributed. North America's trifecta, United States, Mexico, Canada, was supposed to rise and fall together. Instead, tariffs cracked the system down its spine. Mexico, dependent on exporting components into the U.S., was hit on cost. The United States, dependent on cross-border integration, was hit on unpredictability. And Canada, positioned between both, found itself in the rarest position of all, stable. Canadian analysts recognized it within weeks. The country that once moved in Detroit's shadow was suddenly the only one not taking friendly fire. It wasn't that Canada was unaffected. Ontario suppliers felt the strain, and factories tied to Stellantis' network suffered. But the broader structure of Canadian industry held firm because the threat wasn't coming from Ottawa. It was coming from Washington. And that difference mattered. Automakers noticed quickly. When American components became tariff liabilities and Mexican shipments became financial hazards, Canadian production lines began to look like safe harbors. "We could keep working," one Ontario plant manager told us. "That alone made us more valuable than we were 6 months earlier." The shift was subtle at first: trial contracts, temporary rerouting, a few supplier agreements quietly rewritten to route assemblies through Ontario instead of Michigan. But then it accelerated. Logistics planners who once viewed Windsor and Oakville as extensions of Detroit started reconsidering them as independent anchors. One Japanese executive reportedly told his team, "If the U.S. is now a political minefield, then we need to invest where the ground doesn't move beneath us." That ground was Canada. Canadian officials, aware of the unfolding opportunity, began leveraging their strongest asset, predictability. No sudden tariffs, no last-minute policy reversals, no regulatory changes announced at dawn through social media. Ottawa reminded automakers that Canada's trade agreements provide stable access not just to the U.S., but to Europe and the Pacific as well. For manufacturers staring at a maze in the United States, Canada's clarity was more than attractive. it was strategically irresistible. This is why analysts now say Canada is picking up the pieces of the fractured supply chain, not by force, not by design, but by simply remaining steady while the system around it shakes. Every plant closure in Michigan creates a ripple that strengthens Ontario's negotiating position. Every delayed shipment across the southern border makes Canadian ports look more reliable. Every tariff announcement that spooks investors quietly funnels interest northward. And behind these structural shifts lies a deeper truth that insiders keep repeating. Canada didn't win because it moved faster. Canada won because it didn't move erratically. In a moment when American policy became synonymous with volatility, Canada became the one place where automakers could plan past next quarter. The result is a new conversation emerging across global boardrooms, a conversation that would have been unthinkable even a year earlier. When companies ask where North America's next-generation supply chain should be anchored, the answer is no longer assumed to be Detroit. Increasingly, the answer being floated carefully, quietly, but with growing confidence is Canada. By the time the tariff fallout became impossible to ignore, Canada had already shifted into a gear that no one in Washington seemed prepared for. While Detroit reeled from plant shutdowns and spiraling costs, Ottawa was executing something far more deliberate. A stability strategy crafted not for headlines, but for long-term dominance. Insiders describe it as the calm counterstrike, a measured, methodical response that positioned Canada as the one country in the region still capable of offering predictability when everything south of the border began to wobble. It started with a decision that puzzled some observers at first, delaying Canada's aggressive electric vehicle regulations. Critics expected Ottawa to double down on its climate policies, but Prime Minister Mark Carney's team saw the landscape differently. With Detroit's supply chain unraveling, pushing Canada's automakers too fast risked sending factories into the same downward spiral already consuming Stellantis and Ford. "We needed runway, not turbulence," one senior official explained. If the U.S. market was destabilizing, the worst thing we could do was destabilize ourselves. Behind closed doors, the plan was much broader than a simple regulatory pause. Ottawa began working phones across Europe and Asia with more urgency than they had shown in years. Not loud, not performative, quiet, targeted diplomacy. German automakers were asked what they needed to treat Canada as a fallback production hub. Japanese and South Korean executives were pitched on Canada as a stable launchpad for both the American and European markets. Battery producers were offered expanded access to Canada's mineral wealth, nickel, cobalt, lithium, resources increasingly viewed as strategic assets rather than commodities. A senior European trade representative who participated in one of those calls phrased it clearly. Canada wasn't reacting to crisis. Canada was preparing to inherit what the U.S. was letting slip. And it was not just the pitch that caught attention. It was Canada's posture. No tariff threats. No sudden regulatory swings. No political theatrics. Just a steady message. If you want rules you can trust, if you want access without chaos, if you want an industrial base that won't be restructured every election cycle, come here. That reliability made a difference. Automakers, already shaken by the American tariff whiplash, began reassessing Canada's role in their long-term strategies. Insiders in Seoul and Tokyo confirm that at least 2 major Asian manufacturers opened internal feasibility studies for relocating new EV lines to Ontario instead of Tennessee or Texas. One executive described the logic bluntly. Political risk is now a production cost. Canada's risk premium is the lowest in the region. Meanwhile, Ottawa doubled down on its strongest negotiating tool, critical minerals. The global race for EV battery dominance isn't just about factories and assembly lines. It's about who controls the raw materials. Canada's reserves are not just large, they are politically safe. In an era where mineral supply chains from Africa to South America are being pulled into geopolitical competition, Canada's deposits look like a once-in-a-generation advantage. And automakers know it. That is why, throughout late 2024 and early 2025, a quiet stream of delegations visited Canada. European battery executives, Korean mineral refiners, Japanese EV strategists, and even U.S. suppliers hedging their bets. These are not ceremonial visits. They were reconnaissance missions. The shift was big enough that insiders in Washington began noticing something unnerving. Canada was no longer behaving like a junior partner in the North American auto ecosystem. It was behaving like a country preparing to stand independently, able to anchor supply chains even if Detroit weakened further. As one American trade advisor admitted off record, Canada used a plan around Detroit. Now Canada is planning beyond Detroit. The difference mattered. Even while Canadian suppliers felt some pain from Stellantis' troubles, the national strategy was building a protective barrier around the sector, ensuring that instability in the United States didn't automatically drag Canada down with it. It was a bet on structure over shock, on long-game industrial resilience instead of political grandstanding. And as these moves accumulated, a pattern emerged. Plants that depended heavily on U.S. components were encouraged to diversify sourcing. Federal incentives were quietly expanded to attract EV investment, not contingent on American policy stability. Provinces cooperated rather than competed, an unusual alignment driven by the shared recognition that this was Canada's moment to redefine itself. The most telling indicator came from industry analysts who began referring to Canada not as a supporting player, but as the new insurance policy of North America. For automakers burned by unpredictability in the U.S., Canada had become the backup plan that suddenly looked better than the original plan. Every step of Ottawa's strategy, quiet diplomacy, delayed regulations, mineral leverage, stable policy signaling, fed one overarching narrative. If global automakers needed a new anchor, Canada intended to be ready. And as the tariff crisis deepened, that readiness started to look less like ambition and more like inevitability. The global reaction to America's tariff spiral didn't erupt in dramatic headlines or boycotts. It surfaced in subtler ways, shifted meeting agendas, quiet boardroom recalculations, questions whispered rather than declared. But make no mistake, the world was moving. And for the first time in decades, the movement wasn't toward the United States. It was away from it, and increasingly toward Canada. European automakers, some of whom had poured billions into American plants over the past 20 years, began signaling hesitation in private industry briefings. Executives from Germany and France warned their governments that any additional U.S. auto tariffs could force them to slash production or shut facilities entirely. Not because they wanted to leave, but because the cost volatility made long-term investment irrational. One European CEO reportedly summarized the dilemma in a single sentence: "We cannot build a future on a market ruled by improvisation." Japan and South Korea faced a similar crossroads. Their brands were deeply intertwined with the American consumer base, and for decades the U.S. had been their most stable and profitable stage. But tariff unpredictability was now spreading like a virus, infecting supply chain plans, cost models, and even investor confidence. Insiders in Tokyo said major automakers were quietly revisiting their North American strategies for the first time since the 1980s. Korean industry analysts echoed the sentiment. We need a base that doesn't change the rules mid-game. That base, increasingly, was Canada. It wasn't just the lower political risk that mattered. It was the fact that Canada offered something rare: stability across both ends of the Pacific and Atlantic. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership opened access to Asian markets. The Canada-European Union trade deal created a preferential lane into Europe. And unlike the U.S., Canada hadn't weaponized tariffs as a political tool. For companies battered by the American tariff storm, Canada's multi-continental access looked like a shelter with open doors. Meanwhile, China reacted differently. Blocked from the U.S. market by waves of tariffs, Chinese automakers doubled down on Europe, Latin America, and Africa. They slashed prices in the European EV market, undercutting competitors. They negotiated battery partnerships across the global south. They didn't try to win back the U.S., they simply bypassed it. In doing so, They widened the gap the U.S. was creating for itself. For China, America's withdrawal from predictable trade structures wasn't a problem. It was an opening. In this shifting landscape, Canada gained yet another advantage: neutrality. Not the soft, passive neutrality of diplomacy, but the strategic, economically attractive neutrality of a country that didn't provoke trade wars, didn't destabilize markets, and didn't force global automakers to choose sides. As one senior European analyst put it, Canada became the only safe harbor in a region where every other coastline was flooding. That perception became reality. Investment scouts from Asia began scheduling more visits to Toronto, Vancouver, and Ottawa than to Detroit or Chicago. Canadian provincial officials reported sharp increases in inquiries from battery manufacturers and EV startups. Even U.S. suppliers, those directly harmed by the tariff shock, started discreetly exploring partnerships in Ontario and Quebec as a hedge. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were early signs of a structural shift. Inside Detroit, the fear was unmistakable. Executives began acknowledging the unspoken possibility that America might not simply face a temporary downturn, but a gradual repositioning of where global automakers anchor their future. The danger for Detroit wasn't that plants would close overnight. It was that investment, new models, new technologies, new factories would quietly drift toward Canada, one project at a time. And in conversations with industry insiders across Europe and Asia, a new phrase kept appearing: Canada is becoming the Plan B that looks better than Plan A. For Detroit, that was the warning no one wanted to hear. For Canada, it was the confirmation that its steady, calculated strategy was working. Detroit now finds itself standing on a threshold it never expected to reach so soon. For generations, it was the gravitational center of North American auto manufacturing, an industrial force that shaped economies, defined identities, and anchored millions of livelihoods. But in 2025, the landscape has shifted. The numbers are harsh, the trend lines even harsher, and the global response unmistakable. What began as a policy designed to protect American industry has instead exposed its fragility. Stellantis bleeding billions, General Motors absorbing historic losses, Ford stepping back from its own forecasts. These are not isolated tremors. They are signals of a deeper structural imbalance, one that tariffs have pushed into full daylight. Across the border, the contrast is striking. Canada has not outrun Detroit through scale or aggression, but through something far more valuable in a volatile global climate: consistency. By offering stability, predictable regulation, mineral security, and long-term trade access, Canada has positioned itself as the new anchor in a region where trust has become a rare currency. Every investor who questions Detroit's future, every automaker who hesitates to expand in the United States, every supplier who needs a safer foothold, ends up looking northward, not out of sentiment, but out of strategic necessity. And this is the real inflection point. The future of North American auto manufacturing may not be decided by a dramatic collapse or a single factory closure. It may unfold quietly, model by model, investment by investment, as global automakers choose the environment that lets them plan 10, 20, even 30 years ahead. Detroit can still fight for relevance, and insiders insist the city's resilience should not be underestimated. But grit alone will not reverse the gravitational pull that Canada has created. Unless U.S. policy stabilizes, unless long-term trust is rebuilt, Detroit risks becoming a symbol of what was, while Canada becomes the foundation of what will be. For Canada, this moment is more than opportunity. It's transformation, a shift from supporting actor to regional leader, from follower to stabilizing force, from secondary manufacturing base to the strategic center of North America's next-generation auto economy. And if current trends continue, global boardrooms may soon view Canada not just as the safer alternative, but as the primary anchor for the industry's future. The question now is simple: can Detroit adapt before the world finishes moving on? Thank you for watching. If you want to stay ahead of the next major shift shaping North America's economy, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this update with anyone following the auto industry's turning point.